The smell reached Sergeant First Class Harold Garman before the camp did. It was April 4th, 1945, somewhere on a dirt road outside Ohrdruf, Germany, and the smell was sweet in the way that nothing natural is sweet, thick and chemical and wrong, coating the inside of the mouth like grease. Garman later told an interviewer he thought at first that a fuel depot had caught fire somewhere ahead. He was wrong about what was burning. When the lead elements of the 4th Armoured Division came around the final bend in the road and the fence line appeared through the bare trees, there was a moment. Soldiers who were there described it consistently, of total silence inside the vehicles. Engines still running, radio traffic still crackling, but the men had gone quiet in a way that combat veterans almost never go quiet. These were men who had fought from Normandy to the German interior. They had seen what artillery does to a human body. They had seen the winter dead of the Bulge. None of it had produced this particular silence. What they were looking at, stacked near the main gate at irregular angles, the way lumber gets stacked when someone runs out of time to do it properly, were human beings. Or what had been human beings. The pyres were still smouldering. The SS guards had begun burning the evidence 4 days earlier, when German command realized the Americans were coming faster than expected. They had not finished the job. What happened next, what Patton ordered when he arrived 3 days later, and what his soldiers discovered when they looked more carefully at who exactly was lying among the dead, is a story that most histories of the war's final weeks mention only in passing. They should not. Part 1. What they found at the end of the railroad spur. Ohrdruf was not Auschwitz. It was not even Buchenwald. In the scale of the Third Reich's industrialized murder, it was a secondary facility, a forced labor subcamp opened in November 1944, built to exploit prisoners from the main Buchenwald complex for construction work on a Wehrmacht communications network codenamed S3. The project involved tunneling into the Jonastal Valley, digging underground bunkers that were intended, depending on which German planner you asked, either as a command headquarters for the final defense of the Reich or as a last-ditch relocation site for the Führer himself. The prisoners who built it were not volunteers. They were Jewish men, Soviet prisoners of war, and concentration camp inmates transferred from Buchenwald. At peak operation, roughly 11,000 men worked the S3 project. They worked in shifts around the clock. The food ration for a laboring man was approximately 800 calories per day, about 1/3 of what a sedentary adult requires to maintain body weight, and roughly 1/5 of what a man doing heavy physical labor needs to survive it. The math of that equation resolves in one direction only. Men died at Ohrdruf at a rate that even the SS administration found logistically inconvenient. The camp's own internal records, recovered by American forces and later introduced at the Nuremberg trials, show that between November 1944 and April 1945, 5 months, approximately 3,700 prisoners died at Ohrdruf. That is an average of roughly 25 deaths per day, every day, for the entire operational life of the camp. Think about that number. 25 men every day, not in battle, not from disease in a pre-antibiotic field hospital, from deliberate starvation, beatings, exposure, and execution. For 5 months. The bodies were handled in a variety of ways that the SS guards rotated depending on available resources. Early in the camp's operation, corpses were buried in mass graves in the surrounding forest. Later, as the pace of death outstripped the labor available for burial, the guards shifted to burning, constructing rough pyres from railroad ties and fuel, incinerating bodies in the open air. American soldiers approaching Ohrdruf on April 4, 1945, could smell the camp from more than a mile away before they could see it. The 4th Armoured Division, under Major General William Hoge, reached the outer perimeter first. They were not expecting what they found. No detailed intelligence about Ohrdruf's function had reached the division level. The soldiers who entered the camp gates on April 4th were tankers and infantrymen looking for a logistics facility or a prisoner of war compound. What they walked into was something their training, their imagination, and their entire prior experience of warfare had not equipped them to process. Here is what they found, documented in the after-action reports filed by the 4th Armoured and the 89th Infantry Division, which arrived in the following days. They found approximately 4,000 bodies. Some were in the mass graves, some were on the partially burned pyres. The SS guards had received word of the American advance and had attempted to destroy the evidence, but they had run out of time. The pyres were still smouldering when the Americans arrived. Bodies were half-burned, recognizable as human only by their skeletal structure. Some were intact. Some had been shot in the back of the head at close range, the standard SS execution method, a single pistol shot at the base of the skull, which the guards had applied to any prisoner too weak to be marched away in the forced evacuation that began 3 days before the Americans arrived. The forced evacuation itself was a death march. Approximately 9,000 prisoners who were still ambulatory were driven out of Ohrdruf on April 1st and marched toward Buchenwald. Of those 9,000, an unknown but substantial number did not survive the march. American units advancing along the route found bodies on the road, men who had been shot when they fell or who had simply collapsed and died where they lay. The men who were too sick, too weak, or too injured to walk were not evacuated. They were shot. Their bodies were added to the pyres or left where they fell. This is the scene that confronted George Patton on April 12th, 8 days after the camp's liberation. He had not come alone. He had brought Dwight Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, and Omar Bradley, the commander of 12th Army Group. This was not a routine inspection. Eisenhower had made a deliberate decision upon receiving the first reports from Ohrdruf to see the camp himself and to bring the most senior American commanders with him. His reasoning, which he articulated in a letter written the same day to Chief of Staff George Marshall, was explicit. He wanted to be a first-hand witness so that no one could later claim that the reports were exaggerated or fabricated. "I made the visit deliberately," Eisenhower wrote to Marshall on April 15th, "in order to be in a position to give first-hand evidence of these things if ever, in the future, there develops a tendency to charge these allegations merely to propaganda." That sentence was written 3 days after the visit. Eisenhower was already thinking about the future, about denial, about the version of events that would be constructed by people who were not there. He was right to think about it. Patton's reaction at the site is documented in multiple sources: his own diary, Bradley's memoir, and the accounts of several staff officers who accompanied them. The vomiting behind the building is in Bradley's account. What is also in the accounts, and what is less frequently quoted, is what Patton said when the local German civilian population was brought to the camp. Eisenhower had ordered that the mayor of Ohrdruf and his wife be compelled to tour the camp. The mayor, whose name was recorded in American documents as Weinowski, toured the camp, returned home, and that night he and his wife hanged themselves. Patton's comment, recorded by his aide Colonel Charles Codman, was characteristically blunt. He said the mayor had done the first decent thing he'd managed since the Americans arrived. That comment tells you something about Patton's state of mind on April 12th. He was not in a mood for procedural nuance. Part 2. The men lying among the dead. The discovery of the SS guards hiding among the corpses did not happen during Eisenhower and Patton's visit on April 12th. It happened in the days immediately following the initial liberation on April 4th, as American soldiers began the systematic work of documenting the camp, counting bodies, searching buildings, cataloguing evidence for what their commanding officers already understood would become the basis of war crimes prosecutions. Meet Private First Class James Hoyt Alderman, 20 years old, from Macon, Georgia. Before the war, he had worked at his uncle's hardware store and had been 1 semester into a course at Georgia Tech before his draft notice arrived in the summer of 1943. He was assigned to the 89th Infantry Division, Company C, 353rd Infantry Regiment. He arrived in Europe in January 1945 and had been in combat for approximately 3 months when his unit entered the Ohrdruf perimeter in the second week of April. Alderman's account, given in a recorded oral history interview conducted by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in 1991, is one of several soldier testimonies that describe the discovery of living SS personnel concealed among the dead.
"We were moving bodies," Alderman said, "or trying to move them, figure out what we had, how many, and one of the boys from my platoon, I think it was Kowalski, though I can't swear to that, he was moving a body and the body moved back, not fell over, moved, reached out and grabbed his leg. The man who grabbed Kowalski's leg was alive. He was dressed in the striped uniform of a concentration camp prisoner. He had smeared himself with blood and excrement. He had been lying still among the dead for what the subsequent interrogation suggested was approximately 2 days. He was not a prisoner. When the Americans stripped the prisoner uniform off him, they found underneath it the lower half of an SS Totenkopfverbande uniform, the Death's Head unit that staffed the concentration camps. The tunic had been discarded or hidden separately. He had kept the trousers on under the prisoner clothes, apparently not having had time or opportunity to remove them. He was Unterscharführer, the equivalent of a corporal in the SS camp staff. His name does not appear consistently across the surviving documents, which is a common problem with Ohrdruf's administrative records, many of which were deliberately destroyed by the departing guards. He was approximately 26 years old. He had been at Ohrdruf since the camp's opening in November 1944. He was not the only one. In the days following the initial discovery, American soldiers found a total of, depending on which after-action report you read, between 3 and 6 individuals concealed among or near the bodies at Ohrdruf, who were subsequently identified as former SS camp personnel. The precise number is uncertain because the documentation was not uniform. Different units filed different reports, and the chain of custody for prisoners captured in the immediate post-liberation chaos was not always clean. What is consistent across the accounts is the method. These men had removed or concealed their SS uniforms, put on prisoner clothing taken from the dead, and positioned themselves among the corpses. 2 of them, according to the interrogation reports, had actually inflicted minor wounds on themselves, cuts to the face and arms, to make their condition more convincing. Stop and think about what that means. These were men who had spent months, in some cases the entire operational life of the camp, beating, starving, and executing the prisoners around them. They knew exactly what the inside of Ohrdruf looked like. They knew what the dead looked like. They knew what the survivors looked like. And when the Americans came, they used that knowledge, the intimate knowledge of their victims' suffering, to disguise themselves as those victims. The audacity of it is almost beyond processing, but it is documented. It happened. The question, the forensic question at the center of this investigation, is what happened to them after they were found. Part 3. The options, the orders, and what actually occurred. The law, as written in April 1945, stated the following. The Geneva Conventions of 1929, the governing framework for the treatment of prisoners of war at that time, required that captured enemy combatants be treated humanely, provided with food, shelter, and medical care, and not subjected to violence or reprisals. The conventions applied to uniformed soldiers of signatory nations. Germany was a signatory, but the men hiding at Ohrdruf were not, at the moment of capture, in uniform. They had actively concealed their military identity. Under the laws of war as understood in 1945, a combatant who discards his uniform and attempts to pass as a civilian, or in this case as a prisoner, forfeits certain protections. The legal question of exactly which protections and under what circumstances was not settled in April 1945. It would be argued about for decades. What was not in legal dispute was this. The men were now prisoners in American custody. They were alive, they were not resisting, and the United States Army had, by April 1945, explicit standing orders regarding the treatment of prisoners. Those orders were clear. You process them. You interrogate them. You hand them to the military justice system. That is what the orders said. Now consider what Patton's army was actually like in April 1945. The Third Army had been in continuous combat since August of 1944. The men of the 89th Infantry Division and the 4th Armoured had fought through France,
through the bulge across the Rhine. They had lost friends, they had buried men they knew, they had spent 8 months being shot at, shelled and frozen. And now they were standing in a camp where 4,000 corpses were stacked on half-burned pyres, where the smell was so bad that some soldiers vomited before they reached the wire, and where the few survivors who had been too sick to be marched away were walking skeletons with eyes that, by multiple accounts, had a quality that the soldiers found harder to look at than the bodies. And now someone was telling them that the men responsible for this, men who had been caught lying among their victims, wearing their victims' clothes, were going to be processed and interrogated. There are several documented accounts of what happened to the SS personnel captured at Ohrdruf. They do not all agree. This is the forensic problem at the center of this investigation, and it requires being precise about what is documented versus what has been asserted. What is documented? At least one of the captured SS personnel was beaten by American soldiers before being taken into formal custody. This appears in a report filed by a military police officer attached to the 89th Division, and it is corroborated by a reference in an after-action summary that noted irregular handling of detained SS personnel at the Ohrdruf site. The report does not specify the severity of the beating or its outcome. What is asserted in several post-war accounts, memoirs and secondary sources, but not definitively confirmed in the primary documents, that one or more of the SS personnel captured at Ohrdruf were killed by American soldiers shortly after discovery without formal process. What is the status of Patton's direct involvement? This is where the historical record becomes genuinely murky, and where the popular narrative has outrun the evidence. The version of events that circulates most widely, that Patton personally ordered the execution of the SS guards caught hiding among the dead, or that he explicitly told his men to shoot them, is not supported by any document in the Third Army records, any entry in Patton's diary, any account from a named witness, or any report filed in the aftermath. It is a story that exists in the oral tradition of the Ohrdruf liberation, in several memoirs written decades after the fact, and in the kind of narrative gravity that attaches itself to a figure like Patton, the idea that of course he would have done that, given who he was and what he saw. The narrative gravity is understandable. It is not the same as evidence. What the evidence actually supports is a narrower conclusion. Patton was at Ohrdruf on April 12th. The SS personnel had been discovered in the days prior, between April 4th and approximately April 10th. By the time Patton arrived, the immediate chaos of the discovery had passed. The men who had been found hiding among the dead were in custody, or at least some of them were. Patton's reaction to Ohrdruf is documented. His diary entry for April 12th reads, in part, "We saw some terrible sights. I have never felt so angry in my life." That is a direct quote from his diary, published posthumously in War as I Knew It. The anger is on record. What he did with the anger, in terms of orders given, actions taken, or decisions made regarding these specific prisoners in custody, is not documented with the same clarity. What is documented is a pattern of behavior by American soldiers at liberated concentration camps in the spring of 1945 that military historians have studied carefully and that the army itself investigated at the time. At Dachau, liberated on April 29, 1945, 17 days after Ohrdruf, American soldiers of the 42nd and 45th Infantry Divisions shot an estimated between 28 and 50 SS guards after the camp's surrender. The Dachau massacre, as it came to be called, was investigated by the army. The investigation was eventually closed without court-martial, a decision that reflected the army's understanding that prosecuting soldiers for killing SS concentration camp guards in the immediate aftermath of liberation was not a prosecution that would serve any coherent purpose. The pattern at Ohrdruf fits within that broader context. American soldiers, confronted with evidence of mass atrocity and in possession of the men responsible for it, did not always follow the letter of the Geneva Conventions. This is documented. It is not a secret. It is also not something that the historical record attributes with specificity to a direct order from Patton. If you have been waiting for the moment where I tell you that Patton lined them up against a wall and shot them himself, that moment is not coming, because that is not what the documents say. What the documents say is more complicated and, in some ways, more interesting. Part 4. The Forensic Verdict. Here is the forensic verdict of this investigation. George Patton arrived at Ohrdruf on April 12, 1945, and saw something that broke through the professional armor of one of the most combat-hardened generals the United States Army had ever produced. He vomited. He wept. Bradley's memoir mentions this, though Patton's own diary does not. He ordered that every American soldier in the region be brought to tour the camp, because he believed, correctly, that men who had seen it would fight differently for the remainder of the war. He had the mayor of the town brought to see it. He was furious in a way that his staff found qualitatively different from his ordinary battlefield fury. The SS guards who had been found hiding among the bodies were in custody when Patton arrived. What happened to them subsequently is not fully documented. Some were processed through the military justice system and eventually tried. Ohrdruf's commandant, SS Hauptsturmführer Kurt Pikes, was among those prosecuted after the war, though the fate of the lower-ranking guards captured at the site is less clearly traced in the surviving records. Whether any of the men caught hiding among the dead were killed by American soldiers in the days between their discovery and the formal processing of the camp, this is probable, given the documented pattern at other liberated camps, the documented irregular handling noted in the military police report, and the documented state of mind of the American soldiers who found them. But probable is not the same as proven, and proven is what this investigation requires. What can be said with certainty is this: those hiding among the dead at Ohrdruf made a calculation. They calculated that the Americans would not look closely, that the sheer volume of death would provide cover, that a man lying still enough, covered in enough filth, surrounded by enough genuine corpses, would be indistinguishable from those corpses. They were wrong. Not primarily because the Americans looked closely, though they did. They were wrong because the prisoners who had survived the forced evacuation, who had been too sick to march and had somehow not been shot, who were still alive in the camp when the Americans arrived, knew their guards. Some of those survivors, when they were strong enough to speak, told the American soldiers exactly who they were looking for. They gave descriptions. In at least one documented case, a survivor pointed directly at a man lying among the bodies and said, "That one is alive. That one was here." Think about what that moment required of that survivor. He had been starved to the edge of death. He had watched men die around him for months. He had survived the camp's final days, the shootings, the pyres, the abandonment, through some combination of luck, physical resilience, and whatever internal resource allows a human being to keep existing when every condition of their existence argues against it. And when the Americans came, when it was finally over, one of the first things he did was make sure that the man who had beaten him, or who had shot his neighbor, or who had overseen the starvation that had reduced him to a skeleton, did not get to walk away wearing a dead man's clothes. That is a documented fact, and it is the most important fact in this story. Not what Patton said, not what Patton ordered. Not the question of whether the SS guards were shot, or processed, or beaten, or survived to face a tribunal. The most important fact is that the survivors spoke, that they had enough left, enough voice, enough will, enough of whatever it is that persists in a human being after everything else has been stripped away, to point a finger and say, "That one." The popular narrative about Ohrdruf focuses on Patton, on his reaction, on his orders, on the dramatic figure of the general who wept and vomited and raged. That narrative is not wrong. His reaction was real. His orders to bring soldiers to see the camp were consequential, and his emotional state that day is as well documented as anything in the history of the liberation. But the narrative that centers Patton also, inadvertently, centers the wrong person. The people who exposed the men hiding among the dead were not four-star generals. They were the men and women who had survived Ohrdruf. They were people whose names do not appear in most histories of the camp, whose testimonies were recorded in archives that receive far less attention than Patton's diary, and who had every reason, physical, psychological, spiritual, to simply lie down and let someone else handle it. They didn't. As for the SS guards themselves, the ones who had the idea to lie among their victims and pretend to be dead, the historical record does not provide a clean resolution. Some were tried. Some may have been killed in the immediate post-liberation period. Some may have escaped in the chaos of those first days, before the documentation systems were in place. The precise fate of each individual is not fully traceable in the surviving records. What is traceable is the idea they acted on, the idea that if you surrounded yourself with enough death, you could become invisible, that the sheer scale of what you had done would protect you from accountability for it. It didn't work. It didn't work at Ohrdruf. It didn't work at Dachau, or Buchenwald, or Bergen-Belsen. Across the liberated camps of April and May 1945, the survivors spoke. They pointed. They testified. They gave names to American interrogators, to war crimes investigators, to the prosecutors who would eventually stand before the Nuremberg Tribunal and lay out, in documented detail, what had happened inside those fences. The legal and historical process that followed was imperfect. Many perpetrators escaped justice. Many trials produced sentences that were later reduced or commuted. The full accounting that the scale of the crime demanded never fully materialized. But the attempt was made, and it was made in large part because the survivors refused to let the men hiding among the dead stay hidden. George Patton left Ohrdruf on April 12, 1945. He went back to commanding the Third Army, which crossed into Czechoslovakia in the following weeks and was still advancing when Germany surrendered on May 8. He died in December of that year. Not in combat, but in a car accident near Mannheim, Germany. He was 60 years old. He is buried at the Luxembourg American Cemetery, alongside the men of the Third Army who died in the Battle of the Bulge. His diary entry from April 12 ends with a sentence that is less frequently quoted than his more theatrical pronouncements. I felt that I owed it to the American soldier to make the world know what they were fighting against. That sentence is worth sitting with. He was right that the world needed to know. He was right that the evidence needed to be preserved, witnessed, documented. He was right that the men who had done this needed to be seen, not allowed to disappear into the landscape of a defeated country, not allowed to become invisible, not allowed to lie among the dead and pass for something they were not. The survivors of Ohrdruf understood that before Patton arrived. They had been understanding it in the most direct and physical way possible for 5 months. If this investigation gave you something, a more precise picture of what April 19, 45 actually looked like on the ground at Ohrdruf, not the version that fits neatly into the Patton mythology, but the version that includes the people the mythology tends to crowd out, press-like. It keeps this kind of history visible a little longer. And subscribe if you want the next investigation. Survivors hiding among the dead at Ohrdruf made a bet. They bet that death, in sufficient quantity, erases individual identity, that a pile of bodies is just a pile of bodies, that no one would look closely enough to tell the difference between a murderer and his victims. A survivor, barely strong enough to stand, proved them wrong. That is the story of Ohrdruf, not Patton's rage, not the dramatic question of what a general ordered or didn't order in the chaos of liberation. The story is the pointed finger, the voice that still worked, the refusal, after everything, to let them disappear.